All right, hello again, everyone. So today I'm going to talk to you about I'm gonna talk to you about something that actually kind of sucks. And it's what James Clear calls the plateau of latent potential, or as I like to call, at least in my current draft, the valley of death. Now, why am I getting so heated about this graph? Right, it's not a big deal. So, first and foremost, just continuing on with the tiny wins approach. If I'm not mistaken, in my last video about tiny wins, or one of the most recent ones, I started talking to you about the exponential power of 1% improvements, assuming that they compound over time, similar to financial compound interest. In fact, let me go ahead and actually share some of that information with you, just as a reminder, right? So if you don't remember, so one of the powers of 1% improvements over time is that there's this exponential growth, right? So, whereas if you do 1% improvements for a month, you're barely like different than when you started. But on the flip side, if you start doing it for 1 year, 2 years, 10 years, it starts multiplying exponentially, starting from 37 times all the way to 5. That's not trillion. That's something past a trillion. And by 20 years, assuming you're consistent every day, you are like a different being, basically, right? Just given how much exponential improvement you've been doing. But what James Clear does warn us about, and one thing that I've definitely experienced many times in my life, is what he calls the plateau of latent potential. So think about it in terms of when you're first starting to improve. Think about these first few months, right? Where you're like, man, I've been putting in 3 to 6 months of work. And yeah, I'm 6 times better, but I'm 6 times better than trash. So it's like 6 times better than trash isn't that much, right? So I'm gonna read to you, or I'm gonna show you his graph, and then I'm gonna talk to you about what this means emotionally and practically. Because one thing one thing that James Clear does in his book that kind of frustrates me is that he talks about all these concepts and he doesn't really talk about how much they suck in real life. He just kind of glosses over the emotional side, So first and foremost, so this is the graph that he talks about, and he talks about this in the book as the mistake. Sorry, this is the consequence of people making a mistake of thinking that all progress is linear, right? So it's a very complicated bullshit graph, but just follow me. This line is what people expect, right? What you think should happen. You think that, okay, if I put 2 hours of work in, I should see 2 hours worth of results. If I put 3 months of results in, or 3 months of progress in, I should see 3 months worth of results, right? And so we think everything is a zero, like a 1-to-1 comparison. But the problem is, again, the habits approach assumes that growth is non-linear. It's exponential and not linear. And the problem with exponents is that it's, this curve over here, right? This shit sucks. So he calls it the valley of disappointment, where basically you're putting in, so just imagine this is 3 months, 6 months, maybe even 1 year here, and you're way below what you thought you should be, right? You're like, man, I've been putting a year into this. This sucks. Why am I doing this? And this is where a lot of people quit, right? Because that disconnect between what they're expecting in their head and what actually happens in reality is so discouraging, right, that it leads people to quit. They're like, man, I haven't put in any work in, I've been putting so much work in rather, but I'm not seeing any results. I've been working out for like 3 months. I've been working out for 6 months. I've been working out for 9 months, right? And I'm barely seeing any improvement. Nothing's happening. I should quit, or maybe I should try a different strategy, right? And that's what most people do. Now, James Clear glosses over it, and he's like, oh yeah, it's this disappointment, but you'll be fine. And I'm calling his bluff. That's some bullshit. So I'm going to talk to you about, this is my draft right now. This is my experience of the valley of death, but I've shown this to several people, and they definitely, they considered this part of my draft one of the most relatable. And so I'm going to read it in full to you, and then I'm going to just talk to you about, 1, what this means, and then 2, what you can do, and or maybe what mindsets you can have to overcome this. So, despite the initial happiness and possibly even arrogance I feel after taking the first few steps out of my downward spiral, I will inevitably feel extremely discouraged quickly afterwards. I'll see little to no visible progress in myself or my life, despite my attempts to complete tiny wins for days, weeks, months, or even years. I will feel fake and wrong while completing tiny wins day after day, especially when it comes to the tiny wins that are even a little bit outside of my comfort zone. And I'll question whether these small decisions even matter. And to add insult to injury, I constantly see myself relapse back to my bad behavior and to my addictions again and again, despite how many tiny improvements I've made, right? And so the stuff on the bottom is not fully coherent, but these few sentences, I get a lot of feedback saying, hey, Reggie, this is some real shit. So I'm like, okay, now why is that? So once again, let's go back to this graph. But imagine this is your life, right? So imagine, so insert here whatever, New Year's resolution, whatever goal, whatever plan that you have in place, right? I'm going to use exercise because that's pretty universal. I think everyone can relate to that, right? So you start exercising, and if you're anything like me, I mean, you're starting out from a very weak point, right? It's like I haven't exercised in years. I've been in coronavirus times, just eating pizza every other day. That was literally my life, eating pizza every other day and just not moving. So it's like, okay, let me go ahead and work out. So, for the first few days, you see like this rapid increase, right? Let's say you're like, okay, whatever. But then let's say this is month 6, month 9. You're like, man, I've been working out for 6 to 9 months. Nothing's changed. And, there's this frustration. At least for me, there's a deep emotional frustration and anger towards reality here in this little gap here, because I'm like, man, fuck this. Like, I'm putting on all this work and, I could have done things way faster. Or maybe I should just, try and force myself to do more. That's another huge mistake for people building habits. Let me try and do more. And then you overwhelm yourself and then you give up, right? So yeah, emotionally, this is a motherfucker. I don't even I'm using very harsh language right now. I'm using a lot of vulgarity because this sucks. This is probably the worst part of self-growth or getting any sort of meaningful results, right? This period right here. Now, what do you do about it, or how can you reframe it? Now, I'm still experimenting with it, but I think there's a few things. I think the first thing, before I even get into my thing, is there needs to be a humility when it comes to pursuing like lasting growth, lasting habits, lasting results. There has to be a humility, right? In my experience, there's this anger that I have usually comes from this feeling of reality owes me something, right? I've been putting in 6 months of working out, so like I should, quote unquote, I should look this way, or I should be this strong, or I should have this much energy throughout the day. No, like you're not the god of this world, right? You are not the authority that reality has to answer to. So get over yourself, right? It's like reality is what it is, and unfortunately, part of reality is it's nonlinear. So there's an arrogance or there's like this entitlement to a lot of people who are pursuing progress that, including myself, that needs to be let go. I think that's the very first thing to let go of when it comes to overcoming this frustration and really getting through this gap and starting to get this benefit over here, right? And then I think the second thing, and this is going to be more so where I get into my graph, I think there's a few things I need to flesh out, but I do think they're the right answers. I think one consistent thing that I see with people who are successful and like consistently successful is there's this sense of gratitude. I'm putting religious here, like just in terms of the emotion. I'm not saying they're necessarily following a religion, but there are people who are so in love with what they're doing. They're so in love with the process that they give up on the goal and they just kind of work on the process, work on it, and then they're like grateful when they get results. They're not working to get a result like, it sounds like a paradox because obviously they are, but like the primary focus is love for the craft, right? So a really good example, let me see where my examples are. Probably my best example is there's two examples. One is Kobe Bryant, actually. So Kobe Bryant, once upon a time, he was a little kid, right? And he talked about the story of when he went to basketball camp. Now, you would think Kobe, with all of his accomplishments and all of his skill and all of his prowess, he would be dominating at a young level. No, actually. So it turns out when he was 10, 11 years old, he sucked. Like he went to basketball camp. His dad was a basketball player and he got him into a basketball camp with other kids. And Kobe didn't score a single fucking point the whole summer, right? And Kobe talks about him crying about it. He felt like he was inadequate. He's like, man, am I even meant to play basketball? I love it, but I'm kind of trash, right? And so he talks about how there was this insight. It's a very deep insight for an 11-year-old kid, right? But he talks about how, I'll read it. I think this is when the idea of a long-term view became important, because I wasn't going to catch these kids in a week and I wasn't going to catch these kids in a year. So he sat down, said, okay, it's going to take some thought. And then he started creating a menu of things to improve so that when he came back the next summer, he was a little bit better, right? And so the moral of that story is, he wanted to win, right? He wanted to be the best. And it's very discouraging, right? Like going back to this evil graph here, it's really disappointing where it's like, I think he was playing ever since he was 5. So it's like he was playing for 5-6 years already. And then he shows up and he doesn't score a single point. That's deeply disappointing, man. Just imagine working for something for 5 years and you're still trash, right? You know? So, but his love for the craft and his devotion to those tiny improvements is what led him to improve slowly. And again, let me emphasize, he was a little bit better at the end of the year. He wasn't dominating. It's not one of those like overnight stories. He was a little bit better, but then he talks about later in the interview, and you know, I'll put this in the description, but later in the interview, he talks about, hey, yeah, year one, I was better than you by a little bit, but by year 6, year 5, year 6, and you haven't made any major improvements to your game, and I've been improving this whole time, now I'm going to crush you, right? And there was that pride in, you know, trusting that process of gradual improvement and letting go of needing the results right away. And then the second example, which is probably the more inspiring of the two, which is why I put it first, is David Goggins, right? So David Goggins, I don't know if you know his story. I'm sure you know of him, right? You know, the guy who has his shirt off, running crazy miles and stuff like that. But he started off as a loser. I'm not gonna lie to you, right? He was very lazy. By his own admission, he was very lazy. He was very cowardly. He got to a point where, you know, through just sheer bad habits, right? Like just eating a lot, he gained like a lot of weight. He weighed 298 pounds at one point. His career was trash. He was spraying for cockroaches and he was only making $1,000 a month, even though his rent was $810 a month. So he barely had enough money for himself. And then on top of that, he got some random girl pregnant at that time. So this was hell for him. And, you know, one thing that led to his valley of disappointment is, you know, he eventually decided, you know what, I'm going to change my life. I'm going to become a Navy SEAL, right? So he's aiming here. But then he tells a story. It's a sad story, but it's beautiful in the sense of, so when he quit his job, right? So he quit his job. He was like, I'm going to work nonstop towards being a Navy SEAL. And, you know, he found out that he had to lose, I think it was 105 pounds in order to qualify for the Navy SEALs, right? And everyone was telling him, yeah, this is impossible. Just go to the reserves or whatever. Now, the disappointing part was, so prior to him gaining all this weight, he used to run a lot, actually. So he claims, you know, he was like, okay, I'm going to start by running, I think it was 4 miles in his mind. And he was like, you know, I used to run before I was fat. This is going to be easy. And then he runs a quarter of a mile, and then he's out of breath, he's exhausted, and he walks home and he cries. And then he eats like hella junk food, and then he cries again, right? And like, now, this valley of disappointment is a little bit more intense than probably most, because he's trying to do something all the way up here, even though he's super not in that condition physically. But that almost broke him, right? He talks about it very many times when he's telling the story. That almost broke him and made him want to quit and just go back to, you know, spraying cockroaches. But what he ended up doing, and this is the beauty of it, he created a process for himself that was truly motivational, and I don't even have the full extent of it in my doc. I need to add a lot of it. But one of the biggest things before I even get into this stuff is he talked about how he had to shut out the rest of the world, right? And he had to shut out this expectation of even losing 105 pounds, right? He created a self-talk for himself that rewarded him every step of the process, right? So if he lost a pound, that was a huge accomplishment. He would, you know, talk himself up, man, like, you're the baddest motherfucker in the world. You're losing 1 pound at a time, right? Like, and no one would ever do this shit. Like, you're the baddest of all time, right? So he created this beautiful self-talk. And then from there, he found little things to inspire him throughout this journey of disappointment and hell, really. So, you know, for example, he got a lot of inspiration from Rocky, round 14, where Rocky is standing up even though he's beaten the fuck down by Apollo Creed. And let me read this quote. You know, this is a scene where Apollo knocks him down and he thinks he wants to fight, right? And Rocky's trying to struggle back up. And it was the face of Apollo Creed that changed Goggins' life, right? So just by Rocky getting up, not winning, just by getting the fuck up, Rocky had taken Apollo's soul, right? Apollo's face goes down and looks at Rocky and says, what the fuck are you? So he's using things like that, using things like tiny wins, you know, losing 1 pound at a time or half a pound at a time. And then also he does a lot of visualization of the type of person that he wants to become. And he just basically got addicted to that process. And then he, of course, he's still aiming to lose the weight, right? But at a certain point, like through his process, through his love for himself, or his growing love for himself and his growing devotion to this mission of his, he just let go of his expectation of this linear thing. He's like, man, fuck that. Okay, maybe it'll take me a long time. Maybe it'll take me longer than this, but eventually I'll get there, and I have hope for myself. So that's really what I guess I would say. This is very long-winded, but this is something I'm very passionate about because I've lived through this. This shit sucks. I don't care what you're going through. This phase sucks a lot, right? And so, like, if you're in that phase in any stage of your life, I desperately want you to get through that as fast as possible, you know, just like I want to get out of it as fast as possible. So the moral of the story is, a lot of that disappointment is coming from your arrogance, really, right? Your lack of humility. Like, life does not have to be linear, right? You could put 5 years into something and you won't see a result, you know, for a long time. But know that, you know, the results will come, and they will come exponentially as well, right? So that's kind of the first thing. Just be humble and be like, look, my time will come. And then the second thing is you got to fall in love with the journey. I don't know how else to word it. You got to find ways to really motivate yourself, right? I have fictional examples as well, right? Like, I don't know if you guys like One Piece, I do, but like, you know, one of the classic anime archetypes, right, in these shonen animes is the main character gets beat down, and it gets to the point where, you know, they're in a situation where everyone else would be like, man, you can't get out of this. But the main character, what makes them special is they view that hell as training, right? And so I have a few examples from One Piece as well. But regardless, whether it's viewing things as training, whether it's falling in love with, you know, the craft in the case of Kobe, or falling in love with your process of improvement in the case of Goggins, you got to find a way. You got to find a way to make this long ass time feel worth it, right? And so I think that's about it. Again, this shit sucks. Like, I can't even emphasize enough how much this plateau that James Clear glosses over sucks, like, so much. But it's worth going through. But the only way you're gonna get through it is you have to be prepared mentally, and you have to be prepared like you know, psychologically. And so anyway, this is a long rant of mine. You know, hope this was valuable to at least a few of you that's going through this shit. You know, feel free to leave a comment, you know, if you are going through something like this, or if you need clarification, I'd be happy to. And then, I mean, if you have dissenting opinions, I kind of don't give a fuck, but, you know, feel free to leave them, I guess. I'll read them. But that's about it. This is a longer video. I'm just passionate about this topic. Hope you guys have a great week, and I will see you guys on the next one.